The sun burned over the wide desert land and dust rolled like smoke over the prairie. A lonely ranch stood miles from any town. That was where Thomas lived, a man known for his calm heart and quiet strength. He worked with his horses from dawn till night, fixing fences, feeding cattle, and living a life that was more silence than speech. He had no family left, only his land and the wide open sky. One late afternoon, while he was bringing his horse back from the valley, he noticed something strange near the riverbed. At first he thought it was an injured deer, but as he came closer, he saw a young woman lying beside a broken log, her dark hair tangled, her clothes torn from travel. She was small, with bronze skin and eyes that had the color of the earth after rain. She was breathing, but weakly. Thomas quickly tied his horse and knelt beside her. He called out softly, but she didn't answer. She was shivering even under the strong sun. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms and carried her to his horse. He had rescued injured animals before, but never a person like this. As he rode back to the ranch, her head rested against his chest and he could hear her soft, uneven breaths. At the ranch, he laid her on his old cot and brought water. After some time, her eyes opened. She looked frightened, like a wild fawn caught in a trap. Thomas spoke gently, telling her she was safe. She didn't understand all his words, but she could feel the kindness in his tone. Slowly, she sat up, staring around the small cabin filled with tools, blankets, and old wooden furniture. He asked her name, but she didn't speak. Instead, she touched her chest and whispered something in Apache. He understood only a few words from traders and old frontier men, but he caught one word. Noya. He nodded and said, Noya. That's your name? She gave a shy nod. She had no shoes and her feet were bleeding. Thomas boiled water, tore a clean cloth, and began to wash them carefully. She watched him with wide eyes, unsure why this stranger cared for her. She whispered something again, a soft sound like wind through the canyon. He smiled without understanding, but she seemed calmer. Over the next few days, Noya gained strength. She ate small meals he cooked, beans, bread, and sometimes rabbit stew. She would sit quietly near the window, her eyes always scanning the horizon as if afraid someone might come. Thomas didn't ask too many questions, but he could tell she was running from something. One evening, as the sun went down behind the hills, Noya tried to speak more. She pointed to herself, then to him, and said in broken English, You? Ranchman. Thomas nodded. Yes, I'm Thomas. She smiled faintly, trying to repeat his name. Thomas. Then she pointed to her chest and said, Noya, Apache. That night thunder rolled across the sky. Thomas was fixing the roof when he saw Noya outside, shivering in the rain, looking toward the north. He ran out and brought her inside. She looked scared and whispered, Bad men come. They find me. Her voice trembled. Thomas knew what she meant. There were always stories of raids and fights between outlaws and native groups. Sometimes traders betrayed their own. Maybe she had escaped something terrible. He looked her in the eye and said softly, You're safe here. She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed. The next morning, Noya began helping him around the ranch. She carried water, brushed the horses, and even tried to learn his words. Her laugh was soft, but it filled the quiet ranch with warmth it hadn't known in years. One afternoon, as Thomas returned from town with supplies, he found Noya waiting by the fence, wearing one of his old shirts tied around her waist like a dress. When he smiled at her, she suddenly walked forward and said something that froze him. She pointed at him, her eyes firm and voice clear. You are my man. Thomas blinked. What? She took a breath and said again, slower. You are my man. I am your bride. He didn't know what to say. She stood there with pride and certainty, her hands together over her heart. In her world, a bond was made not by papers or preachers, but by loyalty and care. She believed the man who saved her, fed her, and gave her shelter was now bound to her by life. Thomas felt a wave of emotion. He didn't want to laugh or offend her. He just stood quietly looking at her. She wasn't joking. Her eyes held truth, gratitude, and something deeper, trust. He said softly, Noya, you don't have to say that. I was only trying to help you, but she shook her head firmly. No, you save me. You give food. You good man. You are my husband. I am your bride. She touched her chest and then his arm, a gesture of bond. Thomas didn't know what to do. He had lived alone for years, never thinking of love or marriage. Yet seeing this brave young woman speak from her heart stirred something inside him. That night he sat outside by the fire thinking. Noya came quietly and sat beside him, holding a small piece of cloth she had woven from his spare rope threads. She placed it in his hand. "For you," she said. "Apache wife makes for man she loves." Her words hit deep. He couldn't speak. The fire cracked softly as the wind brushed the dry grass. Days turned into weeks. Noya stayed. She smiled more, worked with him, learned more English, and made the cabin feel alive again. The loneliness that once filled Thomas's heart slowly faded. Every time he saw her looking at the sunset, he felt peace he hadn't known before. But one morning, 3 riders appeared at the far end of the ranch. Dust rose behind them as they came closer. Thomas tensed. Noya saw them and froze. Her face turned pale. He stepped outside and waited. The men stopped by the fence. One of them wore a rough coat and had a scar on his face. He shouted, "You got a girl here?" "Apache girl." "She ran from us." Thomas said nothing. Noya stood behind the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. The man stepped closer, his voice growing sharper. "She belongs to our camp. We took her fair." Thomas clenched his fists. "She's not going anywhere." The man laughed. "You sure you want to say that, rancher?" "She ain't your kind." Thomas's jaw tightened. He said, "She's under my roof. That's all you need to know." The men exchanged glances. The one with the scar spat on the ground. "Then you better be ready to fight for her." They turned and rode away, leaving a trail of dust. Thomas watched until they disappeared behind the ridge. When he turned back, Noya was trembling. He went to her and said, "They won't take you. You're safe." Tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "You my man." He nodded slowly, his voice low but sure. "Yes, Noya, I'll keep you safe, always." That night, as stars filled the sky, Noya sat near the fire with Thomas. She rested her head on his shoulder, whispering softly in her language and a promise of gratitude and faith. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He looked at her, then at the horizon. The land that once felt empty now carried a purpose, to protect the one who called him her bridegroom. And though neither knew what the coming days would bring, both hearts had found a reason to stay. The morning came with a strange silence. Even the birds seemed quiet and the air felt heavy. Thomas walked around the ranch, checking his fences, keeping his rifle near. He knew those men might return. He also knew that if they did, they wouldn't come to talk. Inside the cabin, Noya was making bread with her small hands, pressing the dough carefully as she had seen him do. She hummed a soft tune in her language, one that spoke of home and peace. When Thomas entered, she looked up and smiled, though fear still hid in her eyes. He said gently, "If anything happens, you stay inside. Do you understand?" She nodded. "I stay. But I help too." He tried to smile, but his heart was tight. "You've already helped more than you know." All day they worked as if life was normal. Noya brushed the horses and fed the chickens while Thomas cut logs. The wind picked up by evening, sweeping dust across the plains. As the sky turned orange and purple, he saw 3 dark shapes in the distance again. He cursed under his breath. "They're back." Noya froze by the barn. Thomas motioned for her to go inside. "Lock the door," he said. She wanted to stay, but she obeyed. Her heart pounded as she shut the door and looked through the small window. The riders stopped by the gate again. The man with the scar grinned. "We told you we'd be back, rancher." "That girl's worth a lot more than your pride." Thomas stood firm. "You're not taking her. She belongs to no one." The scarred man laughed. "You think she chose you? You're just another fool who doesn't understand how this land works." Thomas's voice stayed calm but strong. "Then maybe it's time it changed." The man spat and pulled out his gun. "Suit yourself." Before he could aim, Thomas grabbed his rifle from the fence post and fired into the dirt near their horses. The loud crack echoed through the valley. The horses reared and the men pulled back in surprise. Thomas didn't aim to kill, but his message was clear. "Next shot won't miss," he said firmly. The men backed away a little, eyes hard with hate. "You'll regret this," the scarred one said. "We'll be back when the law's not watching." They turned and rode off into the fading light. Thomas watched until they vanished behind the rocks. He exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. His hands trembled slightly, but he steadied himself before walking back inside. Noya ran to him the moment he entered. "You hurt?" she asked, her voice shaking. He smiled faintly. "No, just loud noise, that's all." She threw her arms around him and held on tightly. "They go?" He nodded. For now. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat near the fire, the rifle resting beside him. Noya sat across from him, her dark eyes glowing in the firelight. You fight for me, she whispered. He looked at her softly. I fight for what's right, she shook her head. No, you fight for me. Apache woman never forget. He smiled, not knowing what to say. She looked into the flames and spoke again, her English slow and careful. When I was taken, I prayed for help. Sky send you. You strong heart. You, my man. Her words touched him deeply. He looked at her, thinking how fate had brought her to his lonely ranch. He didn't know if he could ever live without her now. Days passed and the world seemed calm again. They worked side by side, mending fences, gathering hay, and caring for the animals. Noya learned more words every day, laughing when she said them wrong and making Thomas laugh too. She loved the smell of the horses, the sound of the windmill, and the quiet evenings when they would sit together by the fire. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One afternoon, Thomas rode out to check his cattle near the creek. He noticed tracks, not animal tracks, but boots and horses. He followed them a short distance and found a torn piece of cloth caught on a bush. It was one of Noya's shawls. His heart sank. He kicked his horse hard and galloped back. When he reached the ranch, the door was open, the window broken. His chest went cold. Noya, he shouted. There was no answer. He searched the barn, the yard, the hills behind the ranch, but she was gone. Only the wind answered him. Rage and fear filled him. He knew who had taken her. The men with the scar. He packed his rifle, rope, and water and rode fast toward the northern trail. He rode through dusk, through the stars, until the faint sound of voices reached him. He tied his horse behind the rocks and crawled closer. There she was, tied near the fire, her head bowed but still proud. The men laughed and argued among themselves. Thomas whispered a prayer, then moved silently. He waited until one man walked off to check the horses. Then he crept behind another, hitting him hard on the head with his rifle butt. The man dropped without a sound. The scarred man turned at the noise and drew his gun, but before he could shoot, Thomas fired once, hitting the rock beside him. The sound echoed like thunder. The scarred man ducked, but Thomas rushed forward and tackled him. The fight was rough, dirt flying, fists hitting hard. Thomas didn't think of pain. He thought only of Noya. When the man reached for his knife, Thomas knocked it away and forced him to the ground. The scarred man gasped. She ain't worth dying for, rancher, Thomas said through clenched teeth. To me, she's worth living for. He struck the man once more, leaving him unconscious. Then he cut Noya's ropes and helped her stand. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. You came? He smiled softly. I told you I would. They left quickly, riding hard through the night. The moon followed them as they crossed the plains back to the ranch. By dawn, they reached home, exhausted but safe. Noya sat by the well, breathing hard, her hair tangled and eyes shining with emotion. She looked at Thomas and said, Now you mine forever. He knelt beside her. Noya, you don't belong to me. You're free now. She touched his chest lightly. No, my heart choose. My spirit choose. You, my husband. No paper, no word, just truth. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then I'm yours too. From that day on, they lived not as master and servant, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two souls bound by fate. Noya learned to write her name. She painted small marks on the walls of the cabin, symbols of protection and home. Thomas taught her to read simple words. She called the ranch Heartland. Sometimes when travelers passed by, they would see them together, the quiet rancher and the gentle Apache woman. People whispered, but Thomas never cared. He had found something truer than anyone's opinion: peace. Seasons changed. The land turned golden again with wheat and wildflowers. One evening, as the sun set red over the hills, Noya stood by the fence watching the light fade. She turned to Thomas and said, You saved me from death. But more, you saved me from alone. He smiled, wrapping his arm around her. You saved me too, Noya. I was just a shadow before you came. They stood in silence, the sky glowing above them. The wind carried the sound of the river and the far cry of an eagle. Years later, people in nearby towns would tell the story of the quiet rancher and the Apache girl who called him her bridegroom. They said they built a life together through storms, droughts, and years of hard work. They said love, once born in fear, grew into strength that no threat could break. And when strangers came asking about them, The old folks would smile and say, "They're still there watching the sunset side by side." She calls him her man and he calls her his heart. In that wild land of dust and dreams, their love remained like an old trail, lasting long after footprints faded.